Thank you so much. You never know what could happen in North Dakota, but certainly it looks, last time I was visiting, a lot safer than Libya in 2011 during the war. But there are dangers in North Dakota. I mean, driving in the snow all the time. But what I'm talking about, you know all about driving in the snow all the time. Not this year. What's wrong with the weather? Thanks a lot to SIM Funds for inviting me to this conference, and it's my pleasure to be addressing you this afternoon, particularly after such esteemed speakers earlier in the morning. I'm going to talk to you about shale oil, a threat to the oil price, question mark. And the question mark is here because probably we are overestimating what is the impact of shale oil and the risk of shale oil for the oil price. Let me say at the very beginning that shale oil and the shale oil revolution is huge. It's very important for the oil industry, for the oil companies, and particularly for the competitive position of the United States in the global economy. Now that I have said the positives about the shale oil, let me tell you why it's not going to be as important for the oil price as many people think. But let's put things into context. What is the shale oil and how big the revolution is? Let's, if we can have the first slide, let's take a look at how many news stories we journalists at the Financial Times and two of my biggest competitors, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, have been writing about shale. And if we can have, yes, you have that. That's the first graphic. Shale News, Financial Times, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal from 1998 to 2013. As you see, we have an inflation. I mean, that looks like the housing prices here in Oslo. We have been writing quite a lot, particularly from 2010 until 2013. We have been writing lots of news stories. That gives you, I use this proxy as a kind of an indication of what's going on. I mean, shale and shale news stories indicate a lot of interest out there because we're writing a lot. Indeed, I checked this morning about how many news stories we have wrote with the word shale since the beginning of the year. We are at the 8th, so 8 days. We have already wrote 93. That's more than any year for the whole year until 2007. So as you see, the inflation of shale news continue, and you will think that you're reading the newspaper, so many stories. Last year, we have 4,013 news stories with shale. For give you a sense of comparison, we only wrote 800 about OPEC. 4,000 shale, 800 for OPEC. What has been the impact of all of this on the oil price? Well, if you look at the other graphic, Brent oil price, that's the annual average, about nothing. Oil prices averaged last year 108 with $71. More or less what they did in 2012, and more or less what they did in 2011, and more than in every other year. Indeed, if you have a bit of sense of history, current prices around 108, today the price is 107 with 50, are absolutely fantastic. As I said, when I started covering the oil market, prices were under $10. Indeed, the first time that my editors took one of my stories for the front page of the newspaper was precisely when we recovered the $10. And remember that one magazine that competed with us, and I'm going to name them because it's very embarrassing. Oh, yes. The Economist said that we're going to $5. So 108 is still a very good price, and it's an indication that things are quite good. And why is that? By the way, I think it's very important to look at annual prices, because what matters really for the finance minister of Saudi Arabia or the finance minister here in Norway is what the price at the end of the year is. What is the average? We see a lot of fluctuations during the year, and obviously journalists and people on the market make a lot of money. We don't make money, but we write the stories that actually pay a salary. We pay a lot of attention to those intraday, intra-week volatility. But at the end of the day, look at the average for getting a better sense. Even in 2008, when we hit $150, the average for the year was just under $100. I think that average for the year gives you a better picture of what's going on the market. So why this inflation of shale news, and indeed a shale revolution in the US, is not having a dramatic impact in oil prices and moving prices down? So let's start to look at how the supply and demand has been working over the last few years. And if we look for the last 3 years, from January 2009 to December of 2013, we'll see that shale oil has had about 3.5 million barrels or million barrels a day of production. We can have the next slide, please. That's a huge. Oh, I'm sorry. Obviously, I'm not doing my job. Here we go. And I beg your pardon, it says December 2012. It should say December 2013. So that's January 2009 to December 2013. The US has increased its oil production by 3.5 million barrels a day. That's huge. That is more than what Iraq is producing today. That's the size of the incremental production in the United States over the last few years. And most of that production, not all, because there has been a bit of Gulf of Mexico deep water, but most of that increase in production is shale oil, and most of that is North Dakota and Texas. So we have a big increase in production, but at the very same time, we have supply problems elsewhere. OPEC disruptions, Libya, Iran, Nigeria, the three most important, have detracted over the same time period 2.4 million barrels a day. The North Sea, here in Norway, but mostly on the UK sector, have also detracted a lot of barrels. That's not a disruption, it's just that the fields are mature, our production is coming down. So the combination of OPEC disruptions and the North Sea problems or maturity have reduced global production by 3.5 million barrels a day. Exactly the increase in the United States. So you need to look at the global oil market in its totality. The main problem is if you get focus on the US shale revolution, you will miss other things that are happening on the oil market. The US is a very important actor in the oil market. It's the world's largest oil consumer. It's also one of the top oil producers. Indeed, it's number 2, number 3. Probably it's going to be the number 1 at some point. But many other things are happening in the oil market that they are important for the picture. And even in the United States, the shale revolution is coming at a time where it's not having the impact that many were thinking it was going to have on the dependence on the Middle East. The US shale revolution is having a dramatic impact on the trade of oil. For example, the United States used to buy a lot of crude oil from Nigeria because it was high quality. It's what many of you in the room are familiar with the oil industry. For those that they are not familiar, it's what we call light, sweet crude oil. It's not that you could give it to the children because it's sweet. It's just, it doesn't have much sulfur, so it means that it's very easy to refine, particularly in gasoline. The shale oil is also light and sweet. So what the United States is doing is stopping buying from Nigeria, but it continues to need crude oil from the Middle East. Indeed, the United States last year bought around 2 million barrels a day of crude oil from the Persian Gulf countries. That's Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, Qatar, Oman, and so on. Not Iran, because by law, the US cannot buy crude oil from Iran. That's more or less the same amount of crude oil that the United States used to import from that region in any given year between 1990 and 1999. And those years, we saw a dramatic expansion of the United States military capabilities in the Gulf in the Persian Gulf, and of course, we saw the intervention of the U.S. and many other allied countries in Iraq-Kuwait war in 1990, 1991. So the U.S. is buying today as much oil as it used to buy when he deployed 500,000 people to liberate Kuwait. So thinking about the US abandoning his relationship with the Middle East and abandoning the Middle East focus just because of the shale revolution is misplaced. Indeed, the United States last year imported from Saudi Arabia 1.4 million barrels a day on average. You know how many barrels of oil the United States imported from Saudi Arabia in 1990? Exactly 1.4. And how many they did in 2000? 1.5. So the shale revolution has no impact whatsoever on the amount of oil that the United States is importing from Saudi Arabia. Indeed, if you look at another country, Kuwait, the United States imported last year from Kuwait 300,000 barrels a day. That's the highest since 1994. It gives you a sense of how shale revolution is having an impact on some corners of the oil market, like sweet oil, like the one that is produced in Nigeria, but not in other corners of the market, like heavy and medium crude oil, sour crude oil with a higher content in sulfur, like the one that is produced in the Middle East. If you look at Nigeria, for sure, it's having a huge impact. The US imported only 250,000 barrels a day from Nigeria. Last year, it was doing about 1 million only 5 years ago. So the impact there has been just absolutely dramatic. Another thing that you need to look when we are talking about shale is that it's a very expensive way of producing oil. The shale revolution only started when oil prices went crazy and we moved from $10 to $100 in the space of a decade. $100 oil triggered a lot of entrepreneurial activity in the United States. And if you give a petroleum engineer enough money or enough money price incentive with oil and enough time, petroleum engineers in general, I have learned in my last 15 years, resolve any problem. I have been trying to marry a petroleum engineer for years, but very unsuccessful. We'll see if Norway I have a bit of more luck. But what has been the impact of shale? Well, among other factors, it has contributed to a huge increase in upstream capital costs. This is a statistic that's indexed 100 in 2000. That's from Cambridge Energy Research Associates. And as you see, the cost of prospecting and finding and then producing oil have increased dramatically, and it's not coming down. And that's in part because of the number of wells that shale requires. It just requires about 10 times more wells than a traditional technology oil field. The wells also mature very quickly. An oil well in a field, say in Libya, for the sake of the argument, starts maturing after 3 to 4 years. In shale in North Dakota, it starts maturing after 3 to 4 months. So you need to drill another well and another and another, and that's expensive. Also, you visit a shale installation in North Dakota, you will be absolutely shocked by the amount of kit, of equipment that they are using. It's not just drilling, it's the amount of pumping capacity that they need to pump water, sand, and chemicals into the ground, and you need to sustain that capacity on the oil field for months to come. And that means that shale is a very expensive technology. What is the break-even price for shale oil in the United States? A very contentious issue. If you ask 2 petroleum engineers or 2 oil executives in the United States about break-even prices in the back-end region, you will get about 6 different answers. So I stopped doing that, but in general, I will say that about $80 is what you need to get an internal rate of return of about 15% in shale oil in the United States on average. Probably some projects are more expensive, some projects are less expensive, and lower prices will not just cancel those projects. But in general, the average when I ask investors is if prices were to drop below $80 and sustain that level for a while, a lot of the money that is being directed in shale oil industry in the United States will stop going there because the rates of return will not be any longer enough to justify. So it's an expensive technology that depends on having high oil prices. It's also a technology that so far is unproved that we can replicate it elsewhere. The main problem is not geology. There are shale formations elsewhere in the world. Texas and North Dakota are not special in that sense. There are probably more shale oil in Russia. It's a huge formation of shale oil, or a potential huge formation of shale oil in Argentina. Good luck with investing in Argentina. We tried, I'm sorry, I'm from Spain. We tried that with Repsol. It didn't work particularly well. Thank God, because I cover the industry, I cannot invest in the shares of that particular company. If not, I will be very unhappy. But what are the main reasons that makes replicating shale very difficult outside the United States? The main reason is law, is legislation. In the United States, individuals who own the land also own the mineral rights of what is underground. If you go to France, you own the pasture, you own the beautiful landscape, but 30 centimeters underground, you own nothing. It's the property of the state. And you have a different proposition. You have less incentive for individuals to allow drilling. You have to deal with the state in France. Good luck with that also. You see that the relationship north-south between Spain and France is improving a lot. But law is a big problem. You also have the entrepreneurial character of the oil industry in the United States that probably it's difficult to replicate elsewhere, outside also Norway. And capital markets are there in the United States to finance those ventures, used to finance this crazy oil executive who thinks that with oil at $80, 5 years ago you could go to the back end and oil that it was not prospective is prospective and you could produce it. You don't have that capital, venture capital in Argentina. For sure you don't have that venture capital in China. So the lack of a capital market able to finance those ventures is a big problem outside the United States. And finally, it's also a problem of logistics. In the United States, you have a rich and well-equipped and very well-trained population working on the oil industry, good petroleum engineers, good operators that you could move from Texas to backend, from backend to Pennsylvania. You have oil service companies. You have pipelines crisscrossing the whole country. When there is no pipeline, we will put the oil in rail, we will put it in trucks, whatever is needed. Replicating that logistics elsewhere outside the United States is not easy. Can the shale oil boom export it outside the US? Yes, it can. The geology is there, but you need a lot of things that they are raised above the ground to be resolved because before you could move it. But also, looking at shale, when I said you need to look at shale oil, used not as in the United States, because if you look at there alone, the story is huge. But you need to put it on the global context. And shale oil is coming at the moment that oil demand is very robust. What killed the oil price in the early 80s was not a boom in production. It did help. It was a big incremental in production in the North Sea, both in the UK and the Norwegian sector. It was also Alaska and the start of some big projects in Venezuela, Nigeria, and so on. It was a wall of oil, a new supply that was coming into the market. But what really killed the oil price was that wall of supply came at a moment where oil demand at a global basis was falling. It was contracting every year because we at Western countries were finding ways to move our economies using less oil. Now we have a very robust oil demand growth. Yes, we have a couple of really bad years, 2008 and 2009, where as you see, we have a drop in oil demand, significant drop, more than 1 million barrels in 2009. But the recent increase in production in 2013 and what we are expecting in 2014, that's about 1.2 million barrels a day. That's a ballpark average from what we have been seeing in the last 14 years. So the oil demand continues to grow. I recently have a long chat with Minister Ali Naimi of Saudi Arabia. As you probably know, probably one of the most influential persons in the oil industry. We met in Vienna in June during the OPEC meeting. And I said, sir, what worries you? And he obviously slapped me because nothing worries him, but he's sometimes concerned about things. So he said, oh, Javier, nothing worries me. I don't miss my sleep. I said, well, sir, does anything concern you? I said, oh, well, yes. I said, okay, well, does shale oil concern you? I say, well, it does, but what really concerns me, if shale oil was coming at a moment when global oil demand was not growing. So what really keeps me awake, if anything, at night, is economic slowdown in emerging markets. That China suddenly crashed, and then we don't have oil demand. And then if you have a big incremental increase in supply, and you don't have incremental demand, then is when we have a problem. But as long as shale oil is coming at a moment of relatively robust economic growth at a global basis and relatively robust increase in oil demand, we are fine. And of course, he said, and bear in mind that you have a big increase in oil supply in the United States, but every year you have disruptions somewhere. And every year, that's also one thing that I have learned. Every year, I think, on the last 15 years I have been covering the oil market, there is always a disruption. This year, we are in day 8 of January, and we have already, we have already problems in South Sudan. We can have problems elsewhere during the year. And of course, we have big problems in Libya. Between South Sudan and Libya, probably we are missing 1 million barrels a day of production. That more than compensate all the increase that we are getting from the United States. And of course, China could be slowing down. Of course, it's not growing as much as it used to. But don't look at China, particularly in the oil market, on percentage terms, because the oil demand has been growing so fast that obviously, if they want to keep up, say, 10% increase, well, they need to run very fast every year, faster every year. If you look at in absolute terms, that is what really matters in terms of oil consumption. Last year, 2013, we have 370,000 barrels a day of increase. This year, we are forecasting about 380, so more or less the same. And as you see, it's more or less what China has been adding to his oil demand every year since 2000. I mean, indeed, only 2008 and 2009 are years where Chinese demand really falters, and those are the years where the global economy is faltering. It's not a Chinese problem, it's a global problem. Of course, we have big increases in demand, 2004 and then 2010. And, you know, we report these numbers, and now we are between friends. One thing I have to say about those numbers, probably 2004 and 2010 and 2008 and 2009, you should really average them, because we don't really know a thing about what's going on in oil demand in China. We don't have good data. We don't know stocks. We don't know strategic stocks of the Chinese government. The Chinese tell a number. Then we check the number of oil vessels that are arriving into the ports, and we try to extrapolate. But is anyone guess exactly what is the level of demand? What is clear when we look at the number of vessels of oil tankers that are arriving to China, what they are discharging, is that more or less they have been doing between 350,000 and 600,000 barrels a day every year of incremental demand. And more or less, that is what we are going to see next year. So China, in the case of the oil market, is not really slowing down, and it doesn't indicate any threat for oil demand. So Minister Naimi claims to be sleeping just fine. What about the supply growth? Of course, supply growth is increasing, and in the last 2 years, we have seen some of the strongest annual increases in the last 20 years of oil. That's non-OPEC supply, by the way. But supply growth from non-OPEC areas is just catching up from the increase in prices. If you see, even in 2011, 2011 was a year. Let's look at the price of 2011, if I can just go very quickly. Look at the price of 2011. I'm going to move. It was more than 110. Indeed, 2011 was the year where we have the highest ever annual average, both in nominal and real terms, the highest ever, more than $112. And if you look very quickly back to this chart about supply growth, look at 2011. We had 200,000 barrels a day of non-OPEC supply. Even we were enjoying the highest ever prices for the oil industry, the global oil industry was almost unable to increase non-OPEC supply. It takes time. Shale oil will help to reverse the trend, and we are beginning to see higher numbers of incremental oil supply every year, but it's still very embryonic, and I don't think that it just makes any threat whatsoever to OPEC. And let's look also at OPEC leader, Saudi Arabia, because a lot of the conversation recently by people that I consider not very well informed is Saudi Arabia is doomed because of shale oil. Shale oil is going to mean that the sheikhs in Saudi Arabia are in big, big trouble. And again, when I was talking to them just 6 months ago, face to face, we have a long conversation, and since then regularly on the phone. And they hear, oh, Saudi Arabia is in crisis. Shale oil is going to be a big problem for the Saudis. And then they see how much oil they are producing. And they say, well, we are fine. I mean, the Saudis will sign today for a deal. If they can stay at 9 million barrels a day, we'll be very happy. I mean, they are producing. Look at how much Saudi Arabia has been producing from 2000 to 2012. 13, and then my forecast for 14. I mean, the 2014 production, I think that probably they are going to be higher than 9 million. 2014 production will be the highest at any moment in the last 10, 15 years, excluding 2012 and 2013, when the Saudis have to go almost at full capacity to make for the loss of production from Iran because of the impact of the European and US sanctions. Indeed, when I hear the people say Middle East oil producers are over because of shale oil. This summer, Saudi Arabia was producing 10.5 million barrels a day of crude oil. On top of that, you have to add about 2 million barrels of what we call in the industry condensates and other liquids, that they are not included on the Saudi numbers because they are excluded from OPEC quotas. So sometimes we say that Saudi produces 10 million barrels of oil, or 10 and a half. Indeed, they are doing 12 and a half. But for the sake of argument, let's focus on crude oil. They were doing 10.5. That's the highest since 1981, at the high of the second oil crisis. Kuwait, they were producing this summer 2.8 million barrels a day. Kuwait has not produced that amount since 1973, during the first oil crisis. And look at the United Arab Emirates. They produce between 2.8 and 2.9. If you ask the Abu Dhabi government, they will say 3. But let's, for the sake of the argument, take the conservative number, 2.8. When was the last time that the United Arab Emirates produced as much oil? The answer is never. They are producing as much as they can, and it's a record high. So if you put them together, the UAE, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, considers really the trio, the core of OPEC in the Middle East. They were producing in July and August the most oil since 1973, 40 years ago. And that's at the moment of a boom and a revolution in the United States. That puts you a bit in context. What is the impact of shale oil in the Middle East? So far, it's not that big. A caveat here. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE, and many other OPEC countries need a much higher oil price today for revenue purposes and for fiscal balance that they were needing 10 years ago. But the same is true for Norway, and the same is true, by the way, for many other countries that they are not even oil producers. We need higher fiscal income today in Spain or France or Italy if we want to balance our budget. So a higher fiscal number doesn't mean to me a lot, but it's something to take into consideration. In the final minutes, I want to talk to you a bit about what geopolitical factors to watch in 2014 for the oil market. And I think that those factors will also have an impact in bonds, currencies, and equity markets. One of the pleasures of covering the commodities industry for the Financial Times is that you not only cover a market, you cover also an industry, you cover the global economy, but also you cover geopolitics. And it's very, very interesting to be focusing on the politics and policies of so many countries. So these are the 6 countries that I will be looking a lot if I was looking at the oil market in 2014. It's an interesting combination because you have Iran, Venezuela, fantastic friends of the United States on one side that you need to keep an eye. You have also the United States that you need to keep an eye this year. And in between, you have Nigeria, Libya, and South Sudan. So why this collection of countries? Well, Iran is, for obvious reasons, as you know, Iran is back into the negotiation table in Geneva over his nuclear program that Tehran says is for peaceful purposes, and Western countries say that is the precursor of an atomic weapon, or atomic bomb. The sanctions that mostly Europe, the new sanctions that mostly Europe lead with the help of the United States, have forced Iran to reduce his production significantly over the last 3.5 years. In 2011, Iran was producing an average of 3.7 million barrels a day. Today, it is doing about 2.6, as the list of countries that they are willing to buy Iranian oil has been reduced significantly. Today, Iran has only 3 major customers still: China, India, and Japan, and a few other countries that buy a bit of oil here and there: Turkey, Sri Lanka, and a bit of Indonesia when they buy just under the table. And probably most of the oil that is bought under the table by the Indonesians ends also in either China or India. We don't know, and I'm not gonna pretend to tell you what the negotiation is gonna say on the nuclear issue. What I will say is that I think it's gonna be more complicated than at first was looking. It's gonna take more time. There will be several setbacks. The market will overreact every time that there is a good positive news. They will think, the market will assume that 1 million barrels of oil from Iran are coming back about yesterday. Every time that is a negative story, sometimes Iranian politician makes a comment in Farsi, obviously intended for public consumption, but someone from Reuters or the Financial Times maybe translated into English, is read by someone in London, and it just read as the negotiations are in trouble, and then the market will rally $10. Even not a single drop of oil has changed in terms of production. So it will be a lot of ups and downs. I think that the Iranians want a deal. I think that the Western countries, we want also a deal. So I suppose that maybe by 2015 we can be closer to a deal. But I think it's going to be a lot more complicated than people think. And we don't know what the damage to the oil fields has been of the last 2.5, 3 years mostly of reduced production. One school of thought believes that the impact has been very positive because has allowed the reservoirs to get pressure again, and that production could come back very quickly. Another school of thought thinks that the reservoirs have been damaged, that the Iranians mismanaged the shutdown of some of the oil fields, and that the production will never recover to the level that we were before the sanctions were introduced. History in general tells us that after a big disruption in a country and forced shutdown, whether it's because of war or sanctions, production takes about 3 to 3.5 years to recover to the pre-crisis level. So we have examples in Kuwait, we have examples in Libya, examples in Sudan, that has been the case. Venezuela, I think that Venezuela probably is a more important political risk to look in 2014 than is even Iran. The new government of Maduro, Nicolas Maduro, is struggling. He doesn't have the popularity of Chavez. Inflation is rampant in Caracas and Venezuela. There are food shortages. PDVSA, the state-owned oil company, is running short of money. It's trying to raise capital in New York, but good luck if you are an oil company owned by the government of Venezuela to go to the United States and try to convince some investors to lend $3 billion. If anyone in this room wants to lend that amount of money to the Venezuelans, they are looking for an investor right now. Any hands? Yeah, I thought so. We saw in December 2002 how when things go very wrong in Venezuela, the oil industry gets affected. It was a major strike in PDVSA, and production fell from about 3 million barrels a day to almost zero in 2 weeks. And we were there for about 2 months. So we can have, again, problems in Venezuela, and they could have a big impact in the oil market. So keep an eye on the popularity of President Maduro, that at the moment is absolutely dropping. Nigeria, also a risk. At the moment, we are losing about 300,000 barrels a day. The country is pumping about 2.1 million barrels a day. They should be doing more 2.4, 2.5 million barrels a day, so 300, 400,000, because violence and theft in the delta. But the main problem is the country is heading towards elections. In 2015, there is a split in the ruling party. It's getting very nasty. The former president Obasanjo released an 18 pages letter to the current president, Jonathan Goodluck. And the letter was not particularly, it was not a Christmas card, let's put it that way. I believe that the nicest thing he said is, you should resign. So that's a particular risk. We can lose quite a lot of oil from Nigeria if things get wrong. On the other side, if the government gets things right, we can see another 300,000 barrels a day coming back to the market. So it's a both ways race to look. More importantly, to look towards the second half of the year, where we will be closer to the elections of 2015, and the politics will be getting very, very heated. Libya. We are back almost to Roman times. For one side, we have the Tripolitana province that the Romans created, wanted some independence and running the country. On the other side, Benghazi, that's the Cyrenaica province, wants to have control of the oil. The main problem for Tripolitana is that most of the oil fields are in Cyrenaica. So the people at the east of the country that, by the way, lead the revolution are demanding independence, or at least autonomy. They are demanding control of the oil revenues, and they have blocked all the oil ports. It's very easy to disrupt production in a country like Libya. You don't need to invade the oil fields. You just basically go to the oil terminal that has a gate for the trucks and the stuff about from there to about here. I have been there in SC there. And you sit people there and say, no one is coming. And no one is coming. The staff cannot go into the oil terminal, so the tankers cannot arrive, so they need to shut down production. Libya should be producing 1.5 million barrels a day. It's doing about 500,000 barrels a day at the moment. The place is very unsecure. 2 oil workers were killed recently where they were walking on the beach. They were working in one of the refineries. Several of the oil fields have been attacked. Oil companies are paying fees to local tribes for protection. It's a bribe, but obviously you cannot say that it's a bribe, because bribes are illegal, particularly to foreign officials. But what oil companies operating in the country is they are paying the local town some money and saying, just keep the thing quiet so we can continue producing. They're building hospitals and schools and things like that. How long that could continue, I don't know. I don't think that is a very sustainable way to operate an oil field. Most of the oil companies don't have expatriates in the fields. It's a very dangerous situation down there. South Sudan produce about 250,000 barrels a day in regular times, as you know, and you in Norway know a lot about Sudan and the Sudan conflict. The country is on the brink of falling into a full-blown civil war. More than 1,000 people have been killed, 200,000 displaced. Production has been impacted. Mostly, so far, only 50,000 barrels a day. But how long the Chinese can continue operating in those situations, I don't know. The Chinese companies have a lot of more acceptance to political risk and safety of their workers that international oil companies like Statoil or BP or Shell or Exxon will have. If the South Sudanese oil industry was run by international companies, and by international companies I mean Western countries, companies, production will be already at zero. It's very, very dangerous to go there because the Chinese are operating some of the oil fields in the Upper Nile state. Some of the production is continuing, so it went down from 250 to 200. Again, a risk in both ways. The negotiations ongoing between the government and the rebels could go well. no signs whatsoever that that's going to be the case in any time soon. But we can be in a situation in which the country goes into full civil war and we lose all the production. It's not a lot, it's 250,000 barrels a day, but when you are missing oil from Nigeria, when you are missing oil from Libya and from other places, I think that is important. I'm running out of time, so very quickly, United States geopolitics, two things to consider. One is what Congress is going to be doing about Iran. As you know, the White House could negotiate whatever he wants to negotiate with Tehran, but it needs Congress on board. And Congress has passed legislation with the sanctions, so only Congress can reverse those sanctions. So far, Congress is a lot more hawkish on the Iranian issue that the White House is. So President Obama could just go to Tehran and shake hands with the president, even with the Ayatollah. If he doesn't get the okay from Congress, nothing will change. The other thing that you need to pay a lot of attention in the United States is the ban or the de facto ban on exporting oil. You cannot export crude oil from the United States. You can export refined products. You can export some crude oil from the United States into Canada and a few other places from Alaska, but you cannot do it from the lower 50 states. There is a debate now whether that ban should be lifted. It was lifted. It will not have a major impact, I think, on the price of oil, what we call the price of oil, Brent, but it could have a lot of impact on differentials between different qualities of oil. Particularly in the region of the Gulf of Mexico and some of the West Africa areas. And finally, I think that the area that also you need to pay a lot of attention in 2014 is the area that I call the BRICS. And no, I'm not talking about the BRICS that Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs described. I'm talking about a different set of BRICS. Those are Brazil, Russia, Iraq, and Kazakhstan. The BRICS, that collection of 4 countries, were supposed to provide a lot of incremental supply into the market this year. Sorry, this year meaning 2013, so last year, and also in 2012. They failed to do. Indeed, Brazil oil production fell to the lowest in 5 years during 2013. Iraq was supposed to increase his production by about 500,000 in 2013. At the end of 2012, it was producing 3.2 million barrels a day, so it should have gone to 3.7. Indeed, it fell. It went to 3.1 because of the insecurity in Iraq, and the situation is getting really bad, particularly in the Sunni triangle around Fallujah. Kazakhstan was bringing the Kashagan oil field, one of the biggest discoveries in the oil industry over the last 20 years. It was coming on a stream in 2013. It has been big problems with the pipelines of the field. Officially, they are coming back with the field in May this year. I'm hearing from people in position to know in the oil industry that it may be delayed towards the end of the year or maybe even 2015. So Kazakhstan is going to put very little incremental oil into the market. And then Russia has been doing better than we were expecting. Even so, it's not bringing the incremental volumes that we were hoping. And indeed, if we look at the whole former Soviet Union region as a whole, it was exporting in 2011 around 9.2 million barrels a day. It was doing 9.2 also in 2012, and last year they only increased to 9.3. So you see almost flatline oil exports from the FSU. So not the hopes from the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, Iraq, and Kazakhstan, that we were thinking. And my final slide is about this geopolitical risk. And I want to give you a bit of a first-hand experience of how bad the situation is in Libya and how the people who are protecting the oil fields look like. That's the people that they were protecting an oil field 2 years ago when I arrived. Particular to notice, the gentleman with the hat and the RPG at the back of the picture was very, very friendly. There was no safety on that thing. They gave it to me. I have another picture with the thing on my shoulder, but I'm a bit embarrassed to show. And he said to me something in Arabic, and I asked my translator, what the hell he's talking about? I said, oh, he said, be careful because your finger is on the trigger and there is no safety. I was pointing towards an oil tank. So anyway, those guys are protecting the oil installations in Libya. It's not particularly a good side. My dad says that they look from the Pirates of the Caribbean movie. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and look forward for your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. You touched upon the situation in South Sudan, so I have actually just two quick questions. We're running a little bit over time, but one question that we have received is what about the gas price?
Natural gas prices. In the United States, they're going to stay low, although this week, obviously, they have gone massively up because the weather in Texas looks more like Oslo than Texas. They will stay low in the United States. We are still about 2 years to see the first real LNG export from the US. At that point, gas prices could come under pressure. We are going to have a lot of LNG production coming on stream in the next 5 years. Australia, one area, and then from 2020 onwards in East Africa, Mozambique and Tanzania, countries to look. So I think gas prices are more under pressure than oil prices. And it's interesting to see that Gazprom is beginning to acknowledge so and willing to negotiate down prices. So not particularly good news for Norway, sorry.
But on the other hand, if I understand you correctly, with your view on the geopolitical situation and your view on the shale oil, there is not much worries for Norway there on the oil price.
No, I think that Norway is fine on oil price. I think that house prices in Oslo are going to remain pretty high as a result. I cannot see, very quickly going down to the oil price, I cannot see a scenario in which we see oil prices averaging anything less than, say, $90 in the next couple of years. Worst case scenario, say, $80. That maybe not as good as it is today, but that historically is still a very good price. $80, $85. Indeed, probably Norway will benefit from somehow lower prices, maybe $80 to $90 will allow some of your European partners to recover quickly. So you will have a benefit on trade. The pressure on the currency will also probably weaken a bit, and still oil revenues will be fantastic.
Yeah, then maybe we can, as a nation, adjust to $80. We don't know. We don't know that. Thank you very much, Javier.
Thank you so much. Thank you.